As promised in this video, I'll be giving away a Fujifilm X Series cap, courtesy of Fujifilm South Africa, so stay tuned at the end of the video to learn how to enter. I always try to be as honest as possible when reviewing gear, but please note that I am a Fuji X photographer and ambassador of the brand. Fujifilm 16-80 f4 lens, a bit of a jack of all trades, master of none type lens. Well, that was my impression before I got my hands on the lens. Now, I've had experience with this type of lens before. There are other manufacturers who make similar focal lengths. There's the Canon 24-105 f4, there's the Nikon 24-120 f4, and I had an experience with one of those. When I was shooting on the Canon 5D Mark I, and I was upgrading to the 5D Mark II many years ago, I didn't have the funds to buy the 24-70 2.8, which is the lens I wanted. But Canon at that stage was offering a kit with the 24-105, and I went ahead with that. Well, that was the worst purchase I ever made. Now, those of you who use the 24-105 and have great results, maybe it was just my lens was a lemon, but just from my experience, out of the lenses I've used in my life, that was the worst. I couldn't sell it quick enough to get the 24-70, which is a far superior lens. I just thought that reach would have been great. I was willing to sacrifice the faster aperture, the faster lens with the wider aperture for the f4 because I had that reach, and I thought that would benefit me. Well, from the reach perspective, it was great. It's just the quality was terrible. When I was shooting at a wide angle, I was getting lens distortion that you shouldn't get on 24. When I was shooting at wide open, wide angle, I was getting vignetting. When I was shooting at the long end 105, I was getting softness in my images, which I shouldn't have been getting. It was a terrible experience. I mean, I got through my work with it, but I couldn't sell it quick enough. So when Fuji told me that they were sending me this lens, which is the same focal range from 16-80 is 24-122 or whatever that is, I think it's around there, I wasn't that impressed, to be honest. I was like, I know these lenses. These are cheap, nasty lenses. Well, I was mistaken. This is not like the other lens I used. It's an incredibly well-built lens. Good balance between the plastic and metal components, which has actually kept the lens at about 440 grams. Which is very light, and its size, nice and small. To be honest, I'm not a huge fan of external extending zooms, not my thing. Internal mechanisms, I think, would have made this lens a lot bigger. I'm not sure of all the physics involved in this, but I'm sure there's a reason why, and obviously being an f4 and not an f2.8 also keeps the size of the lens down. What you'll find is a nice solid zoom ring, no chance of lens creep. It's not going to happen. It's really solid, nice and firm. Now, if you're a pretty creative person, knowing that you've got great image quality with this lens, you can actually get quite a lot out of this lens, which I was quite surprised. Most of us who shoot portraiture, we really do want wide apertures. We want nice, shallow depth of field. We want to be able to separate the background from those subjects that we're shooting. And f4 gets a little bit difficult, especially when you're starting to get into the wider focal lengths. But if you're creative, if you have the ability to understand and position your subject in a particular way, you can actually get very pleasing results. If you've got a background that you can set further back, move the subject away from your background, shoot with it on the 80 end of the lens, stepping back, shooting at f4. Obviously, not every environment allows for this, but there's certainly situations where you can get an out-of-focus background with this lens, but it takes a bit of creativity. But where you do score is where, if you're traveling or if you're doing landscapes, or if you're really trying to keep your weight of your kit down and not travel with multiple lenses. This is an incredible lens. It's light and it's great quality from wide to long end. So whatever you're shooting, you're going to get great image quality. And for those, that's going to be very, very important. So what I did was I went out and just walked with the lens a bit and got a few shots. Nothing special, just a landscape here, whatever. I just wanted to see, the reach that it had, the quality that it had, what it looked wide open, and I was very impressed. Great image quality, very little lens distortion, wider on the wide end, nice quality on the 80 end, and f4 was sufficient for all that type of shooting. So very impressed. But what I did do is I went out and did a little bit of a portrait session with my daughters. They volunteered, and I took them out, and I tried to match up the focal range that I would use with my primes, which are faster lenses, and see, shooting it at the same aperture, meaning if I was to, say, for example, use my 56 if I stop that down to f4 and I shot this at 56, besides the fact that the 56 is able to be, to shoot wider than this lens can, what is the image quality going to be like at that focal range? Because you'd think a prime should be sharper at the same aperture. So first up, we've got two wide angle images. On the right hand side, I have my 14mm prime shot at f4. On the left is a 1680 shot at 16mm. So you'll see the image on the right is slightly wider by 2 mils, nothing major. And just cropping in on the image. All right. Quite close actually. I don't know how easy it is to see on a YouTube video, and I hope you can just take some of what I say into account. The image on the right is maybe just fractionally sharper, but very little, not very obvious, and may contain just a fraction more contrast. And sometimes contrast can actually fool the eye to think that the image is sharper. But these are shot at the same exposure settings. I've done very minor adjustments to them, just increased contrast and saturation, but I did the exact same to both images. And it looks very, very close. Looking at the background, it's hard to tell any major differences there. Yeah, I think this is a good representation. One thing I would say is that the 1680 tends to have a little bit more lens distortion, looking at the horizon line and looking at the shape of my daughter's head turning to the side just on the end of it. But it's very, very slight. So if anything, the 14mm is just a fraction sharper and maybe just slightly less lens distortion. But for a zoom in comparison to a prime, I think this lens has done exceptionally well. On the right hand side, I have the 35mm 1.4 shot at f4. This is one of the first lenses that Fuji brought out for the X series cameras. It's a great lens. On the left hand side is the 16-80 shot at 35mm at f4 as well. So let's go in and have a look at this. All right, this is very close, very, very close. Not easy to tell the difference again on the screen that I'm sure that you're on, but I would say that this actually is a closer sort of comparison than the last two. If you were to present either one of these images to me, I wouldn't be able to tell which is which. Again, I think that the prime lens possibly has a little bit more contrast in it, but yeah, from a sharpness perspective or from an image quality perspective, probably, yeah, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference, to be perfectly honest. I think this is very, very close. Looking at out of focus areas, I don't see anything untoward. Yeah, it's quite close actually. I don't see any major fringing or anything like that. So these two lenses are incredibly close to one another. All right, this is the third example, and on the right hand side is again the 35mm 1.4 shot at f4. On the left hand side, this is the 1680 shot at 35mm at f4. Yeah, I also moved in a bit closer to my daughter this time. I just wanted to not just show you from a distance, because the last shot I was actually standing at quite a distance. I moved into maybe a few meters from my daughter, maybe 3 meters or so, and we can go have a look and see what this looks like. All right, zoomed in. Yeah, I mean, again, this is very, very close, very hard to tell the difference. I would say though, the 35mm 1.4 shot at f4 at this distance from the subject appears to be just ever so slightly sharper. And it's hard to tell because, you might have just missed focus slightly compared to the other image. So, it's not a scientific result by any means. It just appears just fractionally sharper at this distance from the subject, and possibly again just a little bit more contrast in the image, which may be giving the perception of sharpness. But everything else is pretty close. I mean, looking at the out of focus areas, maybe a little bit more fringing on the 1680 in the background there. Nothing untoward, nothing too bad. But wow, it's so close. I mean, again, if you were to shoot either one of these lenses at this 35mm, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference between these two. It's incredibly close. On the right hand side, I have Fujifilm's 56mm f4. It's a well-known lens, a well-respected lens. It's one of their stronger lenses. On the left hand side, I have the 1680 shot at 55mm. I didn't get it bang on 56, but at f4 as well, and the same distance from the subject. So let's go in and have a look here. I think in this example, I'll probably see the biggest difference between these two lenses. Certainly the 16 to 80 at 56 is certainly given a really good account for itself. That is by no means a soft image. It's still a very high level quality. But on the right-hand side, this 56mm is going to be very hard to compete with it. Again, if I zoom out, it's going to be very difficult to tell the difference. They both look great. It's only when I go in as close as I have do I notice the slight difference. Again, a little bit more contrast on the prime lens. Remember, these images are edited with the same settings. And yeah, no extra sharpening added. This is out of this is a raw image out of camera. But probably the biggest difference between the three lenses happens here. But by no means is the left-hand image on the 1680 a bad image. It's incredibly sharp. It's just not as sharp as the 56. Just for interest's sake, the left-hand side is the 16 to 80 shot at 56 at f4, its widest aperture. On the right-hand side is the 56mm prime shot at 1.2. And this is just an example to show you what the benefit would be if you bought a prime. It's a more expensive lens. It's a faster lens. But this is the benefit you get from it. Because if you're shooting portraiture and you want to isolate your subject, and you can see what it does to those backgrounds. Really beautiful effect on the background, beautiful blur. Even the foreground, you'll see on the left-hand side, really does isolate the subject, gives you a beautiful look. Where on the left-hand side, certainly not bad, and it is out of focus. You just get a lot more detail in that background. Sometimes it's a benefit, sometimes not. I would have had to carry 4 primes around to get the same sort of shots, where the 1680 is one lens on the camera all the time, and that would be its advantage over the faster primes. This was the most difficult comparison I could make. On the left-hand side, I have the 16 to 80 shot at 80mm at f4. On the right-hand side is the 90mm shot at f4. Now, you know, from a depth of field perspective, it's not an easy one to compare. That 10mm does make a difference. I try to frame them as close to one another as possible. I wouldn't look at out of focus areas as a big comparison. I would look at more how sharp the image is. I think that the 16 to 80 performs exceptionally well at 80mm, better than I actually thought, because a lot of these versatile lenses with a long focal range, they tend to battle at the long end. That's just been my experience. But it looks exceptionally sharp. It actually looks like it competes very well against the 90. Again, the 90, again, slightly more contrast. That seems to be a pattern with a lot of the prime lenses. And yeah, I would say that there isn't a huge amount of difference. It might have a slight edge over the 80mm, but very, very slight, probably the same as the 35mm, that sort of level of difference. Yeah, so very interesting. So what I've learned from this test is that the 16 to 80mm lens handles its own very well through all the focal lengths. I'd say that where it was the weakest in comparison, but it was being compared to arguably Fujifilm's best lens, was the 56mm range. And wide open at 16, it seemed to have slightly more lens distortion than the 14. So I did a few comparisons here with the lens. At 16mm, I shot it at f4, f8, f16, f22. Overall did very well. I found that in the center of the image, from f4 all the way through, remained very sharp. I would say the sharpest would be in around f8, which is pretty standard. I did find wide open at f4 at 16mm. There was a bit of corner softening. Not too bad, but there was a fraction more, and that improved all the way through to f22. So I did very, very well there. I also then did more of a close-up comparison. So I shot it at 35mm, and I found that the corner sharpness drastically improved. So I found that at f4 was very close to f8, f16, and f22. And then lastly, I did sort of at the 80mm range, and I found that at the 80mm range I couldn't really see much of a difference. All the way from f4 to f22, I thought that corner sharpness held up very, very well all the way through. A couple of interesting things to note on this lens, which I never thought about when I received the lens, was how close you can focus. So at the wide end, at the 16mm end, you can get as close as, from your film plane, not the front of your lens, from your film plane, around 23 centimeters from whatever you're photographing. And when you sort of zooming out to the longer end, to 80, you can get as close as around 34, 35 centimeters to your subject. That's incredibly close. And at f4, you can actually create beautiful separation from whatever you're photographing. So what's an alternative to this lens? Well, the 1655 comes to mind, the 2.8. And you've got to decide, is that extra reach on the focal length more important than a wider aperture of 2.8? Or is 2.8 more important because you might be doing portraiture? It's a more expensive lens, the 1655. The 1680 is a lighter lens. So who is this lens geared up for? I think this lens is well suited to someone who travels, someone who does landscape photography with a little bit of portraiture here and there, but with the intention of only having one lens on their camera at all times. For those of you who have subscribed, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. I've noticed my subscribers have continuously gone up. Very grateful. For those of you who haven't, if you enjoy my content, please do like the video and subscribe, and maybe hit that bell icon for notifications. As it turns out, a lot more complicated than I thought to set up a basic giveaway to comply with YouTube's regulations. So I decided to use a company called gleam.io, and they've set up the competition entry form. They themselves keep to YouTube's guidelines. So once you click on the link in the description, it will take you to the entry form where it will ask you for an email address, your age, and so on, some information. I do not keep your information. I only use it to get back to the winner when the random draw is done. It will, however, ask you to do actions, and that is to enter the competition. One action is to visit my Facebook page, another to visit my Instagram account, as well as my YouTube channel. I have not set it up that you have to like, follow, or subscribe to me to avail of an entry. If you complete the 3 entries, it gives you the option of a bonus 4th entry. So at most, you can have 4 entries into this competition per person. So yeah, if you do like my content, please do like, follow, and subscribe. Otherwise, don't feel that you have to. I do want to grow a base of people that do enjoy my content, and that's important to me. Thanks for your time, and hopefully you're the winner.